Chapter 10 The Last Nightwatchman. Hans-Georg adjusts his tri-cornered hat, then hefts his hellebrand carefully and throws his long black cloak over one shoulder. In the cooler months, he's glad for the warmth it brings. In the hot summer months, it's simply a burden he must bear. Other night watchmen have borne far greater burdens. He makes sure the light in his handheld lantern is lit before he steps out of the alleyway and into the open marketplace. Heads turn, and all eyes are fixed on him as he approaches the steps to the Rathaus in the middle of the town marketplace. He is, after all, an impressive figure, tall and imposing, with long flowing locks, a full beard, an attitude of confidence, and a deadly-looking weapon that inspires respect. Eyeing the crowd with a rakish smile, he calls out, "My name is Hans-Georg." It's an action no night watchman before him ever would have considered. But the eyes that greet him don't hold the disdain that once greeted Rothenburg's night watchmen. These eyes are filled with surprise, mirth, and delight. And then the cameras and the cell phones begin to click. The town looks much the same as it did 700 years ago, and Hans-Georg Baumgartner looks very much like the many night watchmen who went before him. As he strides across the cobblestone streets of the marketplace, he's aware that he is the last of the night watchmen, a fact he shares with the gathered crowd. "I'm the night watchman," he shouts again. "I'm the last one. The others are long gone, but I'm still here." Hans-Georg is indeed still here and is still protecting the town, although the nature of that task has changed over hundreds of years. The responsibility remains. This night watchman no longer has to guard Rothenburg against criminals, drunkards, invaders, or fires. The town has an incredibly low crime rate. Drunkards are few and are easily handled by the local police. Fire is no longer the danger it once was, and the local fire department can respond swiftly and effectively. And these days, the invaders that pour through the town's gates are welcome guests. His responsibility as night watchman is to protect the history, culture, and memory the town has accumulated for the last 1,000 years. It's a task he takes seriously, despite the frequent jokes, nods, and winks he shares with the crowds that join him on an evening stroll through the streets of the walled town. It's no wonder that Rick Steves, the celebrated author of so many best-selling European travel guides, calls him a Robert Plant look-alike who is the Jerry Seinfeld of Germany. Hans-Georg, however, doesn't just go for the easy laughs. As he shepherds his flock of tourists around the town, he brings the town's history to life for them, sharing little-known facts and fables that put this pristine picture book town into perspective. He explodes some myths and embellishes a few others that help capture the flavors, the feel, and even the smells of 1,000 years of the town's evolution. Still, the jokes and laughs are abundant, and one part of the tour always elicits a guffaw or two. As Hans-Georg leads his congregation past a yellow half-timber house, he explains that the foundation of the house is about 1,000 years old, certainly one of the oldest structures in Rothenburg. The rest of the house, he explains, is only about 500 years old, so it's nothing special here in town. Then he points out the name of the building that's painted on the front and the metal caricature of a devil hanging over the door. This tavern is called Zur Hölle, he explains. It means to hell, and it's open late at night. So if somebody in Rothenburg tells you to go to hell, they're actually giving you a good recommendation. Hans-Georg explains to the crowds that Rothenburg has been through multiple reincarnations throughout her 1,000-year history. The town's fortunes have risen and fallen multiple times. There was a time after the 30 Years' War when Rothenburg seemed to disappear altogether. Stripped of her wealth and importance, she became just another small, sleepy town in southern Germany. No one cared about the town, and it slept for 250 years. While his predecessors may have relied on their hellebrands and horns to protect the town, the new sheriff in town uses his wit, wisdom, and storytelling abilities to preserve the history of this small but proud town. One of the tales he tells, and a tale can be true and still a great story, provides his listeners with the reason that Rothenburg remained in such pristine condition throughout history. Like so many German fairy tales, it had a rather dark and ominous beginning. Gathering his listeners around him, the Last Nightwatchman tells them the true tale about how Rothenburg went into a deep slumber that lasted nearly 250 years and enabled the town to awaken from sleep virtually unchanged. The 30 Years' War was not a good time for the town of Rothenburg, begins the Night Watchman. It began as a religious war between the Protestants and the Catholics, but there was very little about it that was religious. In the 1600s, Rothenburg embraced the Protestant Reformation, but that came at a cost. Even though Rothenburg escaped the devastation and destruction of the battles of the war in the early years, they still felt the impact. They experienced the pain and expense of occupation from both Protestant and Catholic armies. And occupation was devastating to a local economy. Incoming armies demanded food, beverage, housing, and more, and they had no plans to pay for any of it. Also, the armies, largely made up of mercenaries, would pillage, loot, and rape. This was a religious war in name only. The participants cared only for what they could glean for themselves. By 1631, the war had begun to shift in favor of the Catholic forces. In October, General Tilly, a general of the Catholic army, had just triumphed in a battle against Protestant forces in Magdeburg. Heading south and east, he and his victorious but weary army were passing through the Rothenburg region. Tilly was uninterested in Rothenburg itself. He was headed south to warmer climates to rest and recuperate for the winter. Nature, as it turns out, had other plans. Torrential rains stalled Tilly's troops not far from Rothenburg. The downpour lasted for a week, and the army's horses and wagons were stuck in the deep mud. They could go no further. And then the weather turned cold. Tilly was forced to change his plans. Knowing that he could no longer traverse south for the winter, he needed to find suitable lodging for his hungry, tired, cold troops. He and his troops were virtually at the gates of Rothenburg, which held all they needed to survive. Tilly then sent a letter by Rider to the leadership of Rothenburg, commanding them to open their gates to his army and to provide them with everything they needed. The people of Rothenburg continued the night watchmen, weren't stupid. They knew what opening the gates would mean, and with Tilly's forces numbering more than 40,000, compared to Rothenburg's population of roughly 6,000, the odds of an all-out battle were decidedly not in Rothenburg's favor. The people and the town fathers knew that to surrender, however, was to allow unspeakable horrors. They knew that armies, especially invading armies, would plunder, steal, rape, and destroy without mercy. There was really no good reason to open the gates to them. Besides, explained the night watchman, the town was well fortified. They were a walled town on a hill. They sat on a year's worth of grain and other food supplies. They knew that the invading army was tired, hungry, and dispirited. So the leadership sent a reply to the commander that essentially said, "No way." As you can imagine, Hans-Georg continued, that didn't sit well with Tilly and his army, and so the siege of Rothenburg began. While they knew they faced an uphill battle, the residents of Rothenburg had some confidence. In addition to the stores they had put away for just such an occasion, they had amassed some 1,000 men upon the walls to defend the city. On top of that, they had a more than adequate supply of munitions with which to protect themselves. The siege of Rothenburg went on for 3 days without Tilly's army making significant advances. Then, the night watchman says with a sad shake of his head, something really stupid happened. There was a citizen of Rothenburg who was responsible for the town's supply of gunpowder. He was tasked with the responsibility to make sure that no unauthorized persons had access to the gunpowder, the town's key to defense. He had one job to do, muttered the night watchman with a hint of disgust and anger. And he blew it, quite literally. For reasons nobody knows, he went in to check on the supply of gunpowder. Remember, this is the year 1631. He couldn't just flip on the light or shine a flashlight around the room. He walked in with his flaming torch burning to make sure everything was in order, and he blew the whole thing up. The watchman explained that not only was the town now without ammunition, cannonballs and musket balls are worthless without gunpowder, but the explosion had blown a huge hole in the town's defensive wall. There was nothing to keep Tilly's troops from marching straight into the town. As expected, the troops poured in and showed no mercy. They killed hundreds of Rothenburg citizens, and they proceeded to strip the town of everything of value. Not an animal, a sack of grain, or a barrel of wine or beer was left. But that wasn't the end of Rothenburg's misery during the army's 3-month stay. The army also brought the Black Plague with them, and the town lost more than 900 citizens to the plague alone. The only saving grace, said the night watchman, was that when they left the town, they didn't burn it down. Our town tried to return to normal, but that wasn't possible. We were devastated. The war went on for another 17 years, and our town was taken 3 more times during the war, each time with similar results. There was nothing left to take from the town, and nothing left upon which it could build. As a result, the town essentially went to sleep for about 250 years. And then, with a gleam in his eye, the night watchman continued. Believe it or not, the town was actually preserved by its poverty. Rothenburg was out of sight and out of mind. While other towns went through destruction and rebuilding, Rothenburg remained untouched and perfectly preserved. There was no remodeling or rebuilding. The town was frozen in time, exactly as it had been in the mid-1600s. All we had to do, the night watchman continued, was wait for the romantic painters and poets of the 1900s to rediscover us. When they finally found us, their paintings and poems went out around the world, and Rothenburg came to life again. All of this led to Rothenburg's next chapter and its next source of wealth: tourism. And with a final smile, the last night watchman looked over his crowd and crowed, "And now we're back. Rich again. World famous. Thanks to you. And thanks for coming. By the way," he continued, before turning away from the crowd, "if you find you can't sleep at night, I invite you to take a walk around the wall. It's very safe. We have a very low crime rate here in town. And there's nothing quite like walking the wall yourself to get a feel for what it might have been back in the days of Rothenburg's glories. Of course," he added, "if you're not up for a late-night walk—" He paused, before flashing a devilish smile. "You can always just go to hell. But keep your eyes open," he added, raising an eyebrow. "You never know what or who you might see. I swear that on occasion I've seen one of the old night watchmen on patrol. You see, a good night watchman never really leaves his post."